Divorced, I left with my kids. Meanwhile, my ex and his family waited for his mistress, Ultrasound. Hi, welcome to my channel. Here's my new story.
5 minutes after signing the divorce papers, I was already on a flew abroad with my 2 children without looking back, as if that marriage had never existed. Behind me, my ex-husband, along with his overbearing mother, his unsettlingly silent sister, and his pregnant mistress, were gathered in a luxury fertility clinic, waiting for the moment their perfect heir would be confirmed. But when the door opened, the doctor wasn't smiling. She looked straight at them and said, "We need to talk. Right now." In that moment, the entire room went silent because what came next would break every single one of them. Before we begin, thank you for being here. It means more than you know. Where are you watching from today? Drop your city or country in the comments. I read every single one. A quick note, this story contains fictional elements woven in for storytelling and educational purposes. Any resemblance to names or places is coincidental, but the message underneath it is worth carrying with you. The morning I ended my marriage, the temperature in Chicago had dropped below 50 degrees for the first time that fall. September 14th, a Tuesday. I remember thinking as I stood outside the mediator's office on West Adams Street in the Loop that the city looked exactly the same as it always had. Taxis cutting through the morning rush on Michigan Avenue, a food cart already open on the corner, steam rising from the coffee urn into the cold air, pigeons working the sidewalk like they owned it. Nothing had changed out there. Everything had changed in here. The conference room on the 14th floor had that particular stillness of a place designed for difficult conversations. A long oak table, high-backed chairs in charcoal gray, floor-to-ceiling windows looking out over the avenue where the first yellow leaves of the season were letting go of the trees one by one, drifting down without ceremony. I had arrived 20 minutes early. I always arrived early. It was one of those habits Dorian used to make fun of. You'd show up early to your own funeral verity. I used to laugh at that. I didn't anymore. Mercer was already there when I walked in, standing by the window with a coffee cup and the quiet composure of a man who had seen 1,000 mornings like this one. He gave me a small nod. That was enough. They arrived at 9:03. I heard them before I saw them. Dorian's voice carrying down the hallway, easy and unhurried, the voice of a man who had already decided how this day would go. He walked in first, Cordelia. His older sister came in right behind him, sharp in a black blazer, her eyes doing a quick sweep of the room the way a real estate agent sizes up a property. Then Rosalind, his mother, moving slowly, her reading glasses pushed up on her head, her expression carrying the particular coldness of a woman who'd made up her mind about me a long time ago and had never once revisited that decision. Dorian didn't look at me when he sat down. He set his phone face up on the table, still checking messages, and leaned back in his chair like this was a business lunch he'd already mentally checked out of. Mercer, who had been my attorney for the past 8 months and who had the steady, unreadable patience of someone paid specifically not to react, placed the document stack in front of each party and began. The mediator walked through the standard language. Asset division, the residence, the vehicles. Each item had already been negotiated. Each line already agreed upon in writing over weeks of back and forth between legal teams. There was nothing left to surprise anyone, or so Dorian believed. When it was his turn to sign, he picked up the pen without looking at the pages. "Mr. Dorian." Mercer's voice was calm and precise. "Page 4. The parenting plan. You are signing over sole legal and physical custody of Stellan and Wren to Mrs. Verity, with unrestricted relocation rights. She will have full authority to determine the children's place of residence without prior notice or consent. Dorian glanced up not at Mercer, but at me, a brief, dismissive look, the kind you give someone you've already stopped considering as relevant to your life. Then he signed. Didn't turn to page 4. Didn't read a word, just signed and set the pen down and went back to his phone. From across the table, I heard Cordelia exhale quietly, something between a laugh and a scoff. "Guess that's taken care of," she murmured, not quite to anyone. Rosalind still hadn't looked at me. She was examining her fingernails with the focused attention of someone who had decided the whole proceeding was beneath her. I had prepared myself for this moment. I had prepared for the anger, for the grief, for the strange vertigo of signing away 8 years. What I hadn't prepared for was the absence of all of it. When the pen touched paper and I signed my name for the last time as Dorian's wife, what I felt was not pain. It was not relief exactly. It was the particular stillness of a person who has carried something heavy for so long that the moment they set it down, they almost don't recognize the feeling of empty hands. I capped the pen. I placed it on the table. Then I opened my handbag, took out a single key on a plain ring, and set it on the oak table in front of the mediator. "The house key," I said. "I moved out with the children yesterday." Dorian looked at the key. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite surprise, not quite confusion, but the faint first register of a man encountering a variable he had not accounted for. It lasted about 2 seconds. Then the smirk came back. "Commendable," he said. It was the first word he had spoken directly to me all morning. I stood up. I picked up my coat from the back of the chair, and then I took Stellan's hand in my left and Wren's hand in my right, my son, 9 years old and trying very hard to look unbothered, and my daughter, 6, who had been quietly drawing stars on the back of a spare envelope with a stubby pencil she'd found in her pocket, and I walked toward the door. We were almost into the hallway when I heard Cordelia one last time. "Good luck out there," she said with the tone of someone who didn't mean it at all. I didn't turn around. Outside the building, the wind off Lake Michigan came sharp and immediate, cutting right through my coat, the first real chill of the season. The black car was already at the curb, a dark sedan, immaculate engine running. The driver was standing beside the rear door in a charcoal uniform, his posture straight and unhurried. I knew from the window of the conference room on the 14th floor that Dorian had seen the car. I had timed it that way. And I knew from the way Cordelia had gone suddenly quiet behind me that the sight of it had registered in a way that the signed documents alone had not. The driver opened the door, and then a second man stepped forward from the sidewalk, broad-shouldered, around 55, with the measured movements of someone accustomed to being useful without being noticed. He held a thick manila envelope in both hands. "Mrs. Verity." He dipped his chin in a brief, respectful nod. "Mr. Mercer asked me to give you this." I took the envelope. It was heavier than I expected, or maybe it just felt that way. I didn't open it. I settled into the back seat, pulled Wren onto my lap, and watched Stellan buckle himself in beside me with the focused seriousness of a 9-year-old who understood on some level that today was not an ordinary day. The door closed. The car pulled away from the curb. I held the envelope on my lap and looked straight ahead as Michigan Avenue opened up in front of us. The same avenue, the same city, the same gray Tuesday morning. But the woman sitting in the back of that car was not the same woman who had walked into that building an hour ago. I had been carrying the weight of that envelope for 8 months. Now at last it was in my hands. The car turned north onto Lakeshore Drive, and through the window, Lake Michigan spread out gray and wide, the same lake I had looked at from our kitchen window every single morning for 7 years. It looked different from a moving car, bigger somehow, less familiar, like something that had always been part of the background of my life and was only now as I was leaving it behind, revealing its actual size. Wren had fallen asleep before we even cleared the loop. She was leaning against my arm, her mouth slightly open, one hand still loosely gripping the stubby pencil she'd carried out of the mediator's office. Stellan sat on my other side, quiet and upright, watching the lake the way children watch things they are trying to memorize. I looked down at the envelope in my lap. It was a standard manila envelope, unsealed, the flap tucked in, thick. My name was written on the front in Mercer's handwriting, precise, economical, no flourish. I had been waiting for this envelope for 8 months. Now that it was here, I found I wasn't in a hurry. I opened it slowly. Inside was a folder, and inside the folder were 3 sections clipped together separately. The first was a set of printed GPS route logs, dates, times, origin points, destinations. I recognized Dorian's office address as a starting point on several of them. The destinations were all the same, a building on East Illinois Street in Streeterville, on the northeastern edge of downtown Chicago, a building I had never been to, a building I now knew very well. From a photograph my 9-year-old son had taken from the back seat of my car on a Sunday afternoon in January. The second section was a stack of receipts, parking validations, fuel charges, a restaurant bill from a place in River North that was not one of Dorian's own. Small things individually, together. They built a picture with the quiet, patient logic of a mosaic. The third section was a copy of a real estate purchase agreement, the property unit 1814 at a luxury high-rise on East Illinois Street, Irville, Chicago. The buyer, a name I recognized. The purchase price, $680,000. The funding source traced through 2 transfers that Mercer's investigator had spent 6 weeks untangling. A joint marital account that Dorian had moved $340,000 out of over a span of 5 months, a little at a time. The way you bleed something slowly so no one notices until it's already gone. I closed the folder. I put it back in the envelope and held the envelope flat on my lap with both hands. 40 minutes to O'Hare, Mrs. Verity. Briggs's voice came from the front seat, steady and unhurried. His eyes met mine briefly in the rearview mirror, then returned to the road. I had learned who Briggs was 3 months into working with Mercer. His full name was Gerald Briggs, 55 years old, 22 years in private driving. The last 5 of them working exclusively for Dorian. He had been let go 6 months ago without notice, without explanation, without so much as a reference letter after half a decade of 6-day weeks and 4 a.m. airport runs. Mercer had found him through the kind of methodical searching that good attorneys do when they're building a case quietly without announcing themselves. Briggs had kept records, route logs, fuel receipts, mileage reports, the kind of documentation a careful professional maintains as a matter of habit. He had handed them over to Mercer without hesitation. "Thank you, Briggs," I said. He nodded once and said nothing else. That was the thing about Gerald Briggs, he didn't need to say much. He already had. Stellan turned from the window. "Mom," he said, "are we going to come back?" His voice was careful. He was 9 and he had his father's directness without his father's cruelty, which was one of those small mercies I had learned to count. I put my hand on his shoulder. I didn't answer right away. I looked down at the envelope, and I thought about Aldous. Professor Aldous Whitmore had been my father's closest friend for 40 years. They had met as graduate students at the University of Chicago back when the campus coffee was terrible and the arguments about economic theory apparently never ended. My father had called him the most honest man I know, which was saying something, because my father had set a high bar for honesty. Aldous taught economics at Boston University now. He had a house in Cambridge with a backyard garden he tended himself, and an opinion about everything offered plainly and without apology. He had flown in for my father's funeral 3 years ago. I remembered watching him move through the reception line at the church, methodical, unhurried, shaking hands with relatives and colleagues and neighbors, saying the right things in the quiet. sincere way that he had. And then Dorian had extended his hand, and Aldous had looked at it for a moment, just a moment, and turned away. Not rudely, not dramatically, simply as though the hand was not there. I hadn't understood it at the time. I hadn't asked. There were too many other things to manage that day. And afterward, the moment had gotten buried under the weight of grief and the logistics of everything that follows a death. I understood it now. After my father passed, Aldous had reached out a letter handwritten about the estate. My father had left a sum in his will held in a trust that Aldous managed. It wasn't a fortune. It was enough. Dorian had been the one to suggest at the time that I leave it alone. Let Aldous handle it. It'll grow, don't complicate things. I had agreed because I was grieving, and because I trusted my husband, and because I was not at that point in my life paying close enough attention to the things that deserved my attention. 8 months ago, I had called Aldous. It was the first conversation we'd had in over 2 years. I told him what I had found, what I suspected, what I needed. He had listened without interrupting, and then he had said, without any particular emotion, "Use the trust. That money is yours, Verity. Your father left it for you. Let's make sure it does what it was meant to do." Stellan was still watching me. I lifted my hand from his shoulder and placed it over his, where it rested on his knee. "We'll come back to visit someday," I said. "If you want to." He thought about that for a moment, the way he thought about most things seriously, without rushing. Then he nodded and turned back to the window. The lake was still out there, gray and enormous, keeping its own pace entirely. The answer to his question had started 8 months ago on a Sunday afternoon in January, when my son ran into the kitchen holding his tablet like it was on fire. January, 8 months before I signed those papers. The kitchen smelled like coffee, and something I had been slow cooking since noon, a pot roast that Stellan had requested specifically because it was Sunday and Sundays. By some unspoken agreement we had developed over years belonged to comfort food. Outside, the snow was the kind that comes down soft and deliberate in Chicago, the kind that doesn't announce itself, just accumulates quietly until the whole city is muffled. Traffic sounds gone. Voices softened everything, reduced to the particular hush of a winter afternoon. Dorian was in Dallas, or so he had told me. He'd mentioned it Thursday evening briefly between checking his phone and pouring a second glass of wine. A supplier meeting. 2 nights. Back Sunday. I had written it in the shared calendar, the way I always did, and thought nothing more of it. There were a lot of trips by then. I had stopped asking for details a long time before I stopped pretending not to notice. Ren was in the living room watching a cartoon about a dog who solved mysteries. Stellan had been at the kitchen table 10 minutes earlier, working on a drawing, before I heard him put on his coat and shoes without saying anything. I assumed he'd gone to check the backyard for what he called snow conditions, an ongoing project of his that involved a ruler and a notebook and more scientific rigor than most adults bring to their hobbies. I was wrong. He came back through the back door at 4:17. I know the time because I glanced at the clock when I heard him the way mothers do, and he was moving faster than usual, still wearing his coat, holding his tablet out in front of him, with both hands like he was delivering evidence to a courtroom. "Mom." He stopped in the kitchen doorway. "I think I saw Dad, but Dad said he was in Dallas." I turned away from the stove. Stellan was not a dramatic child. He didn't exaggerate. When he said something, he meant it, and he meant it precisely the way he said it. So when he held out the tablet with that particular look on his face, not alarmed exactly, but uncertain in a way that was unusual for him, I dried my hands on the dish towel and took it. He had started playing what he called the detective game after watching an animated series about a kid who solved neighborhood mysteries. The game, as far as I had understood it, involved documenting things that seemed suspicious on his tablet camera, a neighbor's oddly parked car, a construction site he walked past, a new store that had appeared overnight. He had accumulated several hundred photographs over the course of about 6 months. I found it endearing. I had no idea it would matter. The photograph was taken from the back seat of my car. I remembered the afternoon the previous Sunday I had driven the kids to North Pier Park near the lake shore. We had come back along Illinois Street, cutting through Streetervilles on the way home. Stellan had been looking out the window the whole time, as he always did, cataloging the city. In the photo, a man was standing on the sidewalk outside a high-rise residential building. He had his back half turned toward the street. Beside him was a woman younger, dark coat, her hand on his arm. They were not touching the way strangers touch. They were touching the way people touch when they have stopped thinking about whether anyone is watching. I recognized the coat before I recognized the man. Dorian had a charcoal wool overcoat from a tailor on North Michigan Avenue that he had owned for 4 years and refused to replace because he said it was the best coat he'd ever had. I had taken it to the cleaners twice myself. I knew it's cut its collar the way it sat across his shoulders. I pinched the screen to zoom in. The building behind him was a glass and steel high-rise, maybe 40 floors, the kind that goes up in Streeterville every few years and immediately starts charging $3,000 a month for a studio. On the awning above the entrance, I could make out 3 words of a building name, enough to identify it. The street sign at the corner of the frame was partially visible Illinois, and a cross street I recognized. This was not River North. Dorian's restaurants were in River North. Dorian had no business in Streeterville that I knew of. "Is that Dad?" Stellan asked. He was watching me carefully. "Can I see this for a little while, honey?" He nodded. Then Wren appeared in the doorway, asking for her tablet back. They shared it on a rotating schedule that was technically Stellan's design and heavily biased in his favor, and I handed her a box of crayons from the counter and gently redirected her toward the living room with the kind of parental efficiency born entirely of necessity. When she was gone, I stood at the kitchen counter and opened Google Maps on my phone. I typed in the building name from the awning. A listing came up immediately. A luxury residential high-rise on East Illinois Street, Streeterville, Chicago. 18 floors of condominiums. Doorman. Rooftop terrace. Asking prices starting at $450,000. I stood there for a moment looking at the listing. Then I sat down on the kitchen stool because my legs had made that decision before I did. The snow was still coming down outside the window. The pot roast was still going on the stove. In the living room, Wren's cartoon dog was solving another mystery, its cheerful theme song floating down the hall. I sat at that counter for a long time, and then I picked up my phone and dialed a number I had saved, but never used the number that Aldous had pressed into my hand at my father's funeral 3 years ago, right after he'd walked past my husband without shaking his hand and said quietly to me, "If you ever need anything, Verity, anything at all, you call this number first." The next morning, I drove to a building on West Monroe Street that I'd never been to before. The sign beside the elevator directory read, Mercer and Associates Family Law Suite 1140. I had looked them up at 2 in the morning. Sitting at the kitchen counter after Dorian had come home from his supposed Dallas trip, kissed me on the cheek with the practiced ease of a man who had been lying for long enough that it no longer required any effort, and gone upstairs to bed. I had sat there in the dark for another hour before I picked up my phone. Aldous had mentioned Mercer's name once years ago, a passing reference at a dinner. Something about a colleague at the University of Chicago who had recommended him for a case involving a mutual friend. I hadn't thought about it since. Funny. The things that stay stored in the back of your mind, waiting. The office was on the 11th floor with a view of the Chicago River and the kind of deliberate, uncluttered decor that communicates competence without trying to impress. Mercer met me at the door himself. No assistant, no waiting room, small talk. He was in his late 40s. With the particular stillness of a man who had learned a long time ago that most situations resolve themselves faster when you stop filling the silence. I sat across from him and put Stellan's tablet on the table between us. He looked at the photographs without touching them for a long moment. Then he asked me to walk him through what I knew not, what I suspected, not what I felt, but what I actually knew and could document. I told him about the building on East Illinois Street, about Dorian's schedule, about the $340,000 I had noticed. Over the past several months, quietly disappearing from a joint account I had largely stopped monitoring because Dorian had told me 2 years ago that he'd set up automatic transfers to a business investment account, and I didn't need to worry about it. I had believed him. That was the part I had to sit with. Mercer listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, then said, "Here's what we need. A private investigator to confirm occupancy and establish a documented pattern. Cook County property records to trace the purchase. Those are public filings, we can pull them directly. And bank records, which your attorney is entitled to request through discovery once we file." He paused. "The bank transfers are the key. If we can show a pattern of moving marital funds to purchase an asset for a third party, that's dissipation of marital assets under Illinois law. It gives us grounds for an emergency temporary restraining order, ATRO, that can freeze his accounts without advance notice." I asked him what that meant exactly. "It means," he said, "that we go to a Cook County Circuit Court judge with the evidence demonstrate that assets are being dissipated in real time and request an emergency order that takes effect before he has a chance to move anything else. Because we file ex parte meaning without notifying him. First, he won't know it's coming until it's already done." I looked at the tablet on the table between us, at my son's photographs taken on a Sunday afternoon because a 9-year-old thought he was playing a game. "How long?" I asked. 6 to 8 months to build it properly," Mercer said, "if you want it to hold." I called Aldous from the parking garage on my way out. He picked up on the second ring. I told him what Mercer had told me. There was a pause, the particular pause of someone organizing their thoughts, not their feelings. "The trust your father set up," he said. "That money has been sitting in a managed account for 3 years. It's yours, Verity. He left it for you specifically, not for your household, not for your marriage." Another pause. "Use it." "Aldous, your father was a careful man," he said. "He planned for contingencies. I think he planned for this one. Use the money." I did. Over the next 8 months, Mercer built the case the way a good attorney builds everything methodically, without shortcuts documenting each piece before moving to the next. A private investigator confirmed regular activity at the Streeterville building. Cook County property records showed Unit 1814 had been purchased 10 months earlier for $680,000. Funded through a series of transfers, Mercer's forensic accountant traced back to the joint marital account. The buyer of record was a name I didn't recognize, a shell arrangement. The investigator explained common enough in high-end real estate transactions where the buyer prefers not to appear on public filings directly. It took 6 weeks to untangle. It held up. In March, Dorian let Briggs go. No explanation. No severance beyond the legal minimum. Gerald Briggs had driven for Dorian for 5 years early mornings, late nights airport runs at 4 a.m. Every variation of "I need the car in 20 minutes. He had kept records because he was a professional and professionals keep records. When Mercer reached out to him 3 weeks after the termination, Briggs brought a box of printed route logs fuel receipts and parking validations to the meeting and set them on the table without being asked. In June, someone else reached out to Mercer's office. Mercer told me about it briefly without details. "Someone close to him," he said. "Someone with access to internal financial records. I'll handle the specifics. You don't need to be involved in that part." I didn't ask who. I had my suspicions. I kept them to myself. In August, Mercer filed the emergency ex parte temporary restraining order with the Cook County Circuit Court. The filing documented 14 months of marital asset transfers, sworn testimony from Briggs' property records, and bank statements. The judge reviewed the filing the same afternoon. The order was signed by the end of the day. It would take effect on September 14th, the day of the mediation signing at 9 a.m. That evening, Mercer called to confirm. I was in the kitchen making dinner. Stellan was at the table doing homework. Wren was drawing something complicated on a large sheet of paper she'd taped to the floor. "Everything is in place," Mercer said. "We move when you're ready." I looked at my children, at the drawing on the floor, at the ordinary, quiet geometry of a weeknight in a house I was about to leave. "I'm ready," I said. I drove home that night and cooked dinner like any other evening. Dorian came home late. He smelled like a restaurant that wasn't his. The particular combination of someone else's kitchen and someone else's perfume that I had learned over many months to simply note and file away. I put his plate on the table. I sat across from him. I asked about his day and listened to his answer and said the appropriate things in the appropriate places. Patience is not weakness. It is the sharpest tool in the room. I had learned that the hard way, and I had learned it well. The flashback ends here. Back to September 14th, the car pulling into the departure lane at O'Hare Terminal 1. The same morning. Just a few miles and an entire world away from everything I had left behind on West Adams Street an hour ago. Briggs stopped the car at the curb. He got out and lifted our bags from the trunk with the same quiet efficiency he brought to everything. No fuss, no commentary. Just the steady competence of a man who understood that sometimes the most useful thing you can do for someone is simply take care of the practical things and let them think. "Safe travels, Mrs. Verity," he said when I stepped out. "Thank you, Briggs. I meant it for more than just the ride." He gave that single nod, the same one from outside the mediator's office, and got back in the car. Inside Terminal 1, the morning crowd moved at the particular pace of people who were either running late or had nowhere urgent to be. Stellan took the handle of his rolling suitcase and walked beside me with the focused composure of a child who had decided somewhere between the car and the sliding doors that this was a day that required his best behavior. He didn't ask questions. He watched everything carefully, storing it the way he did. Wren held my hand and looked up at the departure boards with wide eyes. "Mom," she said, "is Boston far?" "About 2 hours on the plane." She thought about this. "Is it cold there?" "It'll be a little colder than Chicago, but not much. Not yet." "Does Aldous have a dog?" "I don't think so." She accepted this with a small nod, as though she had been gathering information for a report she intended to file later. I had not been inside this airport in 4 years. The last time Dorian and I had flown to Miami for a long weekend, Stellan was 5, Wren was 2, and we had left the kids with Rosalind and spent 3 days pretending that everything was fine. The way you do when you're still at the stage of believing that a change of scenery can fix something that has gone wrong at the foundation. It hadn't fixed anything. We had come home tanned and quieter than when we left. I didn't think about that for long. Some memories don't deserve the airtime. We checked our bags, went through security, found our gate. Stellan sat down and immediately opened the small notebook he carried everywhere. Wren arranged her stuffed rabbit on the seat beside her with ceremonial care. I sat between my children and looked out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the tarmac, where a United flight was pulling back from its gate in the flat gray light of a September morning. And I thought about what was happening at that exact moment across town. I should say here what I said to Cordelia 3 weeks later when she finally told me everything I didn't know in real time, what was going on inside that clinic. I want to be clear about that. I had done what I could do. Mercer had done the rest. Whatever was unfolding at Midwest Fertility and Women's Health Center on North Clark Street in Lincoln Park that morning, I was not there for it. I only know it the way I know most of what happened on Dorian's side of that day. because Cordelia told me later in a backyard in Cambridge over tea that got cold while she talked. But I know it now, and so I'll tell it to you the way she told it to me. The clinic occupied the top 2 floors of a building on North Halsted Street, a few blocks from the park. It was the kind of medical facility that used the word center instead of clinic and offered complimentary valet parking and a waiting area, with a selection of herbal teas and architecture that was clearly trying to suggest both luxury and scientific credibility at the same time. Dorian had chosen it specifically. Cordelia said he had mentioned the name twice in the weeks before, with the particular satisfaction of a man who believed that paying more for something was the same as caring more about it. They arrived at 9:45. Dorian, Rosalind, Cordelia, and Tatum. Tatum, I had never met her, not once, in what I later understood had been nearly 2 years. She was 27, had worked as an event coordinator for one of Dorian's restaurant openings, and had, by the account of multiple people who had been in the same room with both of them, understood very quickly what kind of man Dorian was and what he responded to. Cordelia described her that morning as composed, well-dressed, her hand resting on her stomach with the practiced naturalness of someone who had thought carefully about how she wanted to be seen. Rosalind held her hand walking in, called her sweetheart. Cordelia brought a gift, a small wrapped box, organic, something she couldn't remember exactly. She smiled when she handed it over. She told me later that the smile had cost her more than anything else she had done that entire day. Dorian stood in the middle of the VIP waiting area with his phone in his hand, looking like a man who had just won something. Cordelia watched all of it and said nothing. The gate agent's voice came over the speaker above our heads. Boston Logan final boarding call for rows 20 through 35. Stellan looked up from his notebook. "That's us, Mom." I stood and gathered our things. I looked at my phone once, no messages from Dorian, which was exactly what I had expected. He'd already moved on. As far as he was concerned, that morning had already ended. He had no idea it was just beginning. Later, much later, Cordelia would tell me everything that happened inside that clinic, and I would sit in my new kitchen in Cambridge, holding a cup of tea that had gone cold, and listen to every word. Before I tell you what happened inside that clinic, what the doctor found, and what it meant for everyone in that waiting room, I need to know you're still with me. Drop a number in the comments. Any number. Just let me know you're here. A note: the story ahead contains some fictional elements shaped for narrative and educational purposes. If that's not for you, this is a good place to stop. No hard feelings. Cordelia called me 3 weeks after I arrived in Cambridge. I was standing at the kitchen window of the small rented house on Brattle Street, watching a gray squirrel attempt to scale the bird feeder Stellan had helped me hang the previous weekend. The morning light was thin and pale, the kind that exists only in early autumn in New England, not quite warm, not yet cold, suspended somewhere between seasons like a held breath. My tea had gone cold. I hadn't noticed until the phone rang. I almost didn't answer. I didn't recognize the number. At first she was calling from a different phone, she told me later, because she didn't want the call to appear on any shared family plan. That detail alone told me everything about the position she had placed herself in by deciding to call. Verity, she said, just my name, nothing else for a moment. I sat down at the kitchen table. We spoke for 2 hours. I'm going to tell you what she told me exactly as she told me, because some things deserve to be heard in full, without summary, without shortcut. Some truths lose their weight when you compress them. Cordelia said the morning had started the way Dorian wanted everything to start, with performance. He had reserved the VIP waiting suite at Midwest Fertility and Women's Health Center on North Clark Street, the room with the upholstered chairs and the small side table where the receptionist had placed a fruit arrangement wrapped in cellophane. Cordelia said Rosalind had been the one to suggest the gesture. She had called ahead. She wanted everything to feel like a celebration. Tatum arrived in a cream-colored coat Cordelia had never seen before. It still had the subtle crease of something recently removed from tissue paper. Rosalind stood immediately and took both of her hands. Dorian put his arm around Tatum's shoulders and said something quiet near her ear that made Tatum smile. Cordelia described the smile as practiced, not unkind, but placed there deliberately the way you arrange flowers in a room before guests arrive. Cordelia sat in the chair nearest the window. She told me she spent the first 20 minutes watching the street below rather than the room. She said she was aware, even then, of a particular quality of silence in herself, not peace, but the specific quiet of a person who suspects something and has not yet decided what to do with the suspicion. At 9:40, a nurse appeared at the inner door and called Tatum's name. Dorian stood without being asked. Tatum took his hand. They went through together. Rosalind exhaled slowly and adjusted the fruit arrangement. Cordelia checked her phone. She answered a text from a client. She refilled her water glass from the carafe on the side table. She told me the waiting felt ordinary, the specific ordinariness of people who have no reason to prepare themselves. 22 minutes passed. Cordelia counted them because she had noticed the clock on the wall when they walked in, and she is the kind of person who notices clocks. At 10:02, the inner door opened again, but it was not the nurse. It was Dr. Hargrove. Cordelia described her as a woman in her early 50s, composed and deliberate in movement, the kind of physician who has learned to carry difficult information with both hands so it doesn't spill. She was not hurried. She did not look distressed. She simply stepped into the waiting room, made brief eye contact with Rosalind, and said quietly, without preamble, that she needed a few minutes alone with the patient and the registered partner. She asked Cordelia and Rosalind if they wouldn't mind waiting a little longer. Rosalind stood halfway out of her chair. Dr. Hargrove said gently but clearly, "I'll come back to you as soon as I can. Please take your time." Then she returned through the inner door and closed it behind her. Cordelia told me that Rosalind sat back down slowly the way a person does when they don't yet understand what has changed, but can feel that something has. The room was very quiet. Neither of them spoke. 11 minutes later, Cordelia counted those two. The inner door opened for the third time. Dorian came out first. Cordelia said his face was the face of a man who had just been told something that did not compute, not angry, yet not broken yet, simply suspended in the moment before understanding arrives and changes the shape of everything. Tatum walked behind him. She was holding her coat against her chest rather than wearing it. The fruit arrangement sat untouched on the side table. Rosalind started to rise. "How did it—" Dorian said, "Give us a minute." His voice was flat, not angry, flat in the way that happens when everything else has been removed. Cordelia told me she looked at Tatum's face. She said this is what she remembered most clearly, not what was said, not what Dorian's expression did next, but Tatum's face in that specific moment. She described it as empty, not crying, not frightened. Empty the way a room looks when the last person has just walked out and hasn't yet returned. Dr. Hargrove had explained it without theatrics, Cordelia told me. The NIPT, the prenatal genetic test Dorian had authorized, the one he had requested specifically so his name would be on the record from the beginning, had returned results that included a standard fetal DNA profile. The clinic's protocol, when a registered paternity sample exists on file, is to cross-reference automatically. The cross-reference had produced a mismatch. The DNA profile of the fetus did not match the sample Dorian had submitted at registration. Dr. Hargrove had presented this information calmly with documentation. She had offered a second test. She had said everything a physician is trained to say when delivering information that is accurate, clinical, and devastating. Cordelia said Dorian did not raise his voice in the clinic. He did not shout. He simply stood with the paper in his hand for a long moment, and then he set it on the chair beside him. And then he walked to the window and stood there with his back to the room. Tatum had not moved. Rosalind said, "What is happening?" And Cordelia said she didn't answer because she didn't have an answer that would help. That was when Tatum began to cry. Not the way you cry when you are frightened. Not the way you cry when you are caught. Cordelia said it was the kind of crying that comes from somewhere further back, older than this room. Older than this morning, the kind that suggests the person has been holding something much heavier than anyone knew, for much longer than anyone realized. Cordelia leaned forward and touched her arm, and Tatum looked at her. Not at Dorian, not at Rosalind, and said in a voice so low, Cordelia almost didn't hear it, "This isn't the first time." Cordelia stopped. I stopped too there in my kitchen on Brattle Street, holding a cup of cold tea. "What did she mean?" I asked. Cordelia was quiet for a moment. "She meant," Cordelia said slowly, "that there had been another pregnancy before this one, and that Dorian didn't know." Cordelia paused on the phone when she got to this part. I heard the soft sound of liquid being poured something heavier than water from the way it settled. A glass set down on a counter. "You need to hear this," she said. "All of it." I pulled my chair closer to the table. Outside, the squirrel had given up on the bird feeder and disappeared into the hedge. The kitchen was very still. "All right," I said. "I'm listening." She told me the hallway outside the consultation suite was the kind of hallway that wasn't designed for scenes. It was a narrow corridor, pale walls recessed, lighting the faint antiseptic smell that lingers in every medical building, regardless of how carefully they've decorated the waiting rooms. A framed print of Lake Michigan hung near the exit door, abstract blue-green, the kind of art chosen specifically to be unrememberable. Cordelia and Rosalind had followed a few steps behind when Dorian and Tatum came out of the consultation room. They hadn't been asked to follow. They had simply moved, the way people do when something shifts in a room and the body understands it before the mind catches up. Dorian stopped in the middle of the hallway. He didn't turn around to check if they were there. He seemed to have forgotten briefly that anyone else existed. He looked at Tatum, and Cordelia told me his voice when it came was quieter than she had expected. "Whose is it?" 3 words, no preamble, no softening. Tatum looked up at him. Cordelia said she could see the calculation happening behind her eyes, the rapid, almost mechanical process of a person deciding in real time which version of the truth to offer. But she had just come out of a room where the clinical truth had already been delivered without her permission, printed on paper, cross-referenced against a sample with her name on the intake form. There was no version left that held together. "I don't know," Tatum said. Dorian was quiet for a moment. "You don't know." "I told you I don't." "That's not what I asked you." His voice dropped further. Cordelia said that was what made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. Not volume, not anger, but the complete removal of warmth from a voice she had heard laughing at dinner tables for 2 years. "I asked you whose it is." It came out in pieces. Not a confession, Cordelia was clear about that. Not something prepared or rehearsed. It came the way things come when a person is standing in a hallway under fluorescent lights with nowhere left to go, and someone they trusted is looking at them like they no longer recognize their face. Tatum said it had happened before they were serious, before things between her and Dorian had become what they became. There had been a pregnancy earlier, briefer, a situation she had handled on her own and not told him about. "Handled," Dorian repeated. She hadn't told him because she said she hadn't been certain about him. About the timeline, about what she wanted. Cordelia told me Tatum used the word complicated. And that word landed in the hallway with a specific kind of weight, the weight of a word used to replace several other words that are harder to say out loud. Dorian turned and looked directly at Cordelia. Cordelia had taken one step back. Rosalind to her left had gone very still, the particular stillness of someone whose body has received information that the mind is not yet processing. Her color, Cordelia said, had drained completely. Not shock exactly. More like the recognition of something she had almost allowed herself to suspect and had talked herself out of. "Did you know about this?" Dorian asked. Cordelia told me she held his gaze. She didn't look away, didn't look down, didn't offer anything that could be read as either confirmation or apology. "No," she said. "I didn't know about this." He stared at her for a moment longer. "But," she added, and she told me she chose the word deliberately, the way you place a stone in the middle of a path. "I know about other things." Cordelia said his expression shifted in a way she found difficult to describe. Not guilt, not fear. Something closer to the look of a man who has just realized for the first time that the room he thought he controlled has more doors than he knew. He didn't ask her what she meant. She didn't offer. That was the agreement she told me unspoken made in a hallway in 3 seconds, sealed by the decision of both of them not to say the next sentence. Rosalind found her voice eventually. She said Tatum's name once quietly, and Tatum looked at her the way a person looks at someone they have failed. Not with defiance, but with a kind of exhausted grief that had no performance left in it. "I thought it would be different," Tatum said, "with him." Rosalind didn't respond. Cordelia told me she stood there in that hallway and felt something she hadn't expected, not satisfaction, not vindication. She said it felt like watching a structure that had been built on the wrong foundation finally admit in the language of small sounds and silent faces that it could not hold. She said she looked at Dorian one more time. He was no longer looking at Tatum. He was staring at the floor near the exit door, and his jaw was set in the particular way it sets when he has decided something. She had seen it at contract negotiations, at family arguments, at the closing of deals she was never fully briefed on. She knew what it meant. It meant the conversation was over. It meant something else had already begun. And then his phone rang. Cordelia told me she was standing close enough to see the screen from where she was not close enough to have leaned in just close enough to catch it in her peripheral vision when it lit up. The name on the display read Thornton, First Midwest Bank. Dorian looked at the screen for exactly 2 seconds. She counted, she said the way she had counted the minutes in the waiting room, and then he silenced it. But Cordelia saw his hand tighten around the phone before he slid it into his jacket pocket. "He didn't answer it," she told me, "but I could see from his face that he knew he was going to have to." Cordelia said Dorian walked away to take the call. She watched him go down the length of the hallway, past the framed print of Lake Michigan, past the exit door he didn't push open, until he reached the far end where the corridor turned and the light was dimmer. The way she described it, I could picture it precisely. A man walking in a straight line towards something he couldn't yet see, moving with the residual confidence of someone who has not yet been told that the ground beneath him has already shifted. She didn't follow, neither did Rosalind. They stood near the consultation suite and waited in the particular silence of 2 people who have nothing left to say to each other, but nowhere else to be. Cordelia couldn't hear the call from where she stood, but she told me she didn't need to. She said she has known Dorian since he was 26 years old, since before the restaurants, before the investors. Before the version of himself he had spent the last decade carefully constructing. She knew how he held his body when he received good news and how he held it when he didn't. She watched his posture change the way a building changes when something foundational gives way, not all at once, but in the slow, unmistakable language of weight redistributing itself. His shoulders dropped first, then his free hand, which had been loose at his side, pressed flat against the wall. She said he stayed on the phone for nearly 4 minutes. Then he lowered it, stood with it at his side, and looked at the floor. She told me what Thornton had said because Dorian told Rosalind later that afternoon. And Rosalind, in a moment, Cordelia described as the first honest thing she had done in months, repeated it word for word. Thornton, the senior relationship manager at First Midwest Bank, who had handled Dorian's accounts for the better part of 6 years, had called to inform him that the Cook County Circuit Court in Chicago had issued an emergency temporary restraining order that morning. An ex parte order, meaning it had been granted without Dorian's presence or prior notification, based solely on the evidence submitted by the petitioning party. All accounts bearing Dorian's name individually or jointly had been frozen effective 9/47 that morning. The petition, Thornton told him, cited the dissipation of marital assets, the legal term under Illinois divorce law, for the use of shared marital funds for purposes unrelated to the marriage, particularly in anticipation of divorce proceedings. The filing included documentary evidence wire transfer records totaling $340,000 moved from a joint account, a signed real estate purchase agreement for a condominium unit at a Streeterville address, and a sworn affidavit from a former company employee. Thornton did not say the employee's name. He didn't need to. Dorian asked who had filed the petition. Thornton said, "The petitioner is listed as Verity." Cordelia was still standing near the consultation suite when Dorian came back down the hallway. He looked at her. She told me it was a different look than the one he had given her earlier, not the dismissive, half-distracted glance of a man who has already moved past you in his mind. This one was slower, more careful. She described it as the look he reserved for people in negotiations when he had just realized he had underestimated something. "He looked at me," she said, "the way he always looked at people he thought were beneath him, except this time he wasn't sure anymore." She held his gaze. She did not offer him anything, not explanation, not sympathy, not the small social gesture of looking away first. She simply looked back at him and waited. He turned and walked toward the exit. She watched him from the lobby window. The parking structure was visible from where she stood, a low, open-air level, adjacent to the clinic, accessible through a glass door on the east side of the building. Dorian's car was in the second row. He got in, closed the door, and didn't start the engine. He sat there for 20 minutes. Cordelia told me she knows it was 20 minutes because she counted. She had developed a habit, she said, of counting things. That morning, minutes in waiting rooms, seconds on phone screens. The number of steps between one version of a situation and the next. It was, she said, the kind of thing you do when you are trying to stay inside the facts and out of the feelings. During those 20 minutes, she told me Dorian made a call. Not to Thornton again, not to Rosalind, to someone whose name she didn't know. She could see him talking, could see the particular posture of a person having a conversation. They had not wanted to have the slight forward lean the hand moving once across the back of his neck. She found out later through Rosalind that it had been his own attorney, a man named Calloway, whom he had retained for business matters and had now, in the span of a single morning, found himself needing for something else entirely. What Calloway told him, Rosalind repeated later with the resigned accuracy of a woman who had stopped trying to protect anyone from the truth. Mercer had filed the TRO petition at 8:15 that morning, more than an hour before the scheduled mediation, more than 90 minutes before Dorian had sat down at a long wooden table on Michigan Avenue and signed a document without reading page 4, the affidavit from the former employee Gerald Briggs, who had served as Dorian's personal driver for 5 years before being let go without cause or explanation. 6 months prior included GPS route logs, fuel expense records, and time-stamped parking receipts documenting 41 separate trips that did not correspond to any business itinerary on file. The Streeterville condominium purchased for $680,000 using funds transferred from the joint marital account in 6 separate transactions between February and July, was now subject to a court-ordered encumbrance, pending the outcome of the dissolution proceedings. Dorian asked Calloway how long this had been in preparation. Calloway, who was a careful man and chose his words accordingly, said he couldn't know for certain, but the documentation was thorough. The affidavit was detailed. The financial trail was unambiguous. Long enough, Calloway said, long enough to be very difficult to challenge. Cordelia said she watched him sit in that car and understood in the wordless way you understand things you have suspected for a long time, that this was the moment Dorian realized the past 8 months had not been a marriage quietly ending. They had been a case being built. She was still standing at the lobby window when his phone lit up again. She could see it from where she was, the screen brightening through the windshield glass, casting a faint glow across the interior of the car. She couldn't read the name from that distance, but Dorian looked at it for a long moment before he answered, and she could tell from the way his posture changed when he brought the phone to his ear that this call was different from the last one. When she told me about it later, I asked her whose name she thought she had seen. Pemberton, she said, his CFO. And from the look on his face, whatever Pemberton had to say, it was worse. The part about the company, Cordelia wasn't there for it directly, but Pemberton told her about it afterward because Pemberton had worked alongside both of them for 6 years. And I think the way Cordelia said it quietly, near the end of the call, he felt that someone needed to know the full picture, not a version of it, not the version Dorian would eventually tell. Shaped and edited the way he shaped and edited everything that reflected poorly on him. The whole thing unabridged. So Cordelia told me, and I'm telling you. Dorian arrived back at the River North office at noon. The space was open plan on the upper 2 floors. Glass walls exposed brick, the kind of design that had been considered modern 6 years ago and now simply read as expensive. His team occupied the 2nd floor. His own office was on the 3rd corner, facing with a view of the Chicago River that he had described in at least one profile interview Pemberton remembered, as the reason he had signed the lease. Pemberton told Cordelia that the floor was quieter than it should have been when Dorian walked in. Not empty. People were at their desks. But the particular quality of noise that fills an open office keyboard's casual exchanges, the ambient rhythm of a functional workplace had been replaced by something more careful, heads that turned and then turned back too quickly, conversations that stopped at a slightly unnatural moment. Pemberton had been expecting him. He was standing near the glass partition when the elevator opened, and he said that from the look on Dorian's face, he already knew the call from the parking garage hadn't gone well. "My office," Dorian said. Pemberton followed. He had printed the emails, 3 of them, one from each of the major distribution partners, whose contracts represented the structural core of the company's projected revenue for the following fiscal year. He laid them on the desk in a single row, evenly spaced the way you lay down cards, when the hand is already decided and you are simply showing what you hold. Dorian read them standing up. He didn't sit. Pemberton told Cordelia he had learned over 6 years that Dorian sitting down meant he was processing. Dorian standing meant he was already past that. The first letter was from a regional hospitality group based in Naperville, a 4-year supply and licensing agreement representing $2.8 million annually, terminated effective immediately, citing a clause in Section 12 of their agreement that allowed for early exit upon documented evidence of financial misrepresentation by the contracted party. The second was from a corporate events firm in the West Loop, a 3-year catering partnership worth $1.9 million, terminated on similar grounds, with a formal reference to information received regarding the financial conduct of the principal officer. The third was from a distribution company out of Schaumburg that had been with them since the beginning. That one, Pemberton said, was the one Dorian read twice. $2.5 million, 6 years of relationship, one paragraph of termination language signed by a man Dorian had taken to dinner no fewer than a dozen times. Total contract value lost $7.2 million. Early termination penalties. The amounts Dorian's company now owed those partners for breaking the agreements from their end, regardless of their stated justification, came to $1.8 million. Who sent them the documents? Dorian asked. He was still standing. He had set the third letter back down on the desk with a precision that Pemberton described as the kind of care a person takes when they are working very hard not to show their hands. Pemberton said he didn't know. Someone did, Dorian said. Yes, Pemberton said. Someone did. He told Cordelia later that he had his own thoughts about who. That the documents in question, internal financial summaries, account transfer records, a breakdown of certain discretionary expenditures that had been run through the company's operating budget, rather than through personal accounts, were not the kind of materials that existed in many places. They required access. They required understanding. They required someone who had spent enough time close to the center of the operation to know exactly which records would matter to a business partner conducting due diligence. But he didn't say this to Dorian. He said he didn't know, and he let the silence after that statement carry whatever weight it needed to carry. Pemberton opened his laptop and turned it to face Dorian. The spreadsheet was already prepared. He had built it that morning before Dorian arrived, because he had received the first termination notice at 7:42 and had understood by 8:15 that the day was going to require documentation. With the penalties and the lost contracts, he said, "We're looking at a shortfall of $2.3 million against current operating projections, and that's before we account for the bank side." The bank side meaning the frozen accounts, the TRO, the fact that the operating capital Dorian had been relying on to service the company's existing obligations, vendor payments, payroll, the outstanding balance on a commercial lease renewal that had been quietly deferred for 2 quarters was now inaccessible by court order. Dorian looked at the spreadsheet for a long moment. "How long before payroll is affected?" he asked. Pemberton told him 3 weeks if nothing changed. Dorian nodded once slowly, the way a person nods when they are filing a piece of information in a part of their mind they don't intend to share. "I'll handle it," he said. Pemberton told Cordelia that he had heard Dorian say those 3 words many times over 6 years. He had learned to read the difference between the version that meant the problem was manageable and the version that meant Dorian had not yet accepted that it wasn't. This, he said, was the second version. He was still in the office when the desk phone rang. Not the cell phone he had been carrying all morning, the desk line, the one that rang through the main reception. Pemberton said he almost didn't notice it at first, but then the assistant's voice came through the intercom, clipped and careful. "Mr. Dorian, there's a call holding from the Chicago Department of Public Health. They say it's regarding your North Side location. They said it's urgent." Pemberton watched Dorian's face. For the first time since walking into the office that afternoon, something shifted behind his eyes, something smaller and more specific than the broader shock of the morning. Not surprise, exactly. More like the expression of a man who had been watching a line of dominoes fall and had just realized there was one more piece standing that he had forgotten to count. He reached for the phone. "I found out about the restaurant license from Mercer." He had been monitoring the public records filings through the Cook County Clerk's office, a standard practice when a TRO is active and the opposing party's assets are subject to court oversight. He sent me a message that afternoon, a single line with a case file number attached. I was at O'Hare by then, moving through the terminal with Stellan on one side and Wren's hand in mine, and I read it on my phone between gates. By the time I boarded, it was done. I didn't learn the details of what happened inside that office until later, some of it from Mercer, some from Pemberton, some from the public inspection record that became part of our court filing, but I've put it together since then the way you put together the account of something you weren't present for, but understand entirely because you were the one who set it in motion 8 months before. The call to Dorian's office came at 2:14 in the afternoon. The inspector from the Chicago Department of Public Health identified himself, gave his division and employee number, standard procedure, Mercer told me later, for calls regarding license actions, and informed Dorian that a complaint had been received that morning, accompanied by supporting documentation. The documentation had been specific enough to trigger an immediate, unannounced inspection at the River North location, the flagship, the one that Dorian had opened 11 years ago with 40 seats and a review in the Tribune that he had framed and hung in the back hallway, the one that had grown to 230 covers, a private dining room on the second floor, and 3 consecutive years on Chicago Magazine's Best New American Restaurants list, which was an odd designation for an 11-year-old establishment, but one his publicist had apparently negotiated the language for. The inspection had been conducted that morning before opening. 2 inspectors, 2 hours full scope. They had found 3 violations. Not the minor kind. Not paperwork gaps or labeling errors or the low-grade infractions that most commercial kitchens accumulate and clear in a single follow-up visit. These were what the Chicago Food Code classifies as critical violations deficiencies that present a direct risk to public health and require immediate corrective action or immediate closure. The first was the refrigeration system in the primary cold storage unit, a temperature variance documented over 3 separate readings, consistent with a unit that had not been serviced or recalibrated in more than 8 months. The maintenance log, which inspectors had requested on-site, showed the last scheduled service had been canceled in January and not rescheduled. The second was the hood suppression system above the main cooking line, a fire and food safety requirement that had been flagged in the previous year's routine inspection as needing follow-up within 90 days. The follow-up had not been completed. The replacement parts had been ordered in February and returned unopened in March. The return receipt was in the file. The third was the food safety supply inventory, specifically the absence of current-dated sanitizing solution and the expired certification on 2 of the line staff's food handler cards, which under Chicago Municipal Code Title VII require renewal every 3 years and had lapsed in the spring. Taken individually, any one of these might have resulted in a warning, a fine, a required correction timeline. Taken together and presented alongside documentation showing that the maintenance budget for the River North location had been systematically reduced over the preceding 8 months, with corresponding transfers out of the operating account into a personal discretionary line. They constituted grounds for immediate suspension of the operating license, effective that afternoon. I want to be clear about something because I know how this sounds. I did not report the restaurant to destroy it. I reported it because the records I had found, the transfer logs, the canceled maintenance orders, the return parts showed that Dorian had been pulling money out of the operating budget of a business that employed 41 people in order to furnish a condominium on the 18th floor of a Streeterville building for a woman whose name was not on a single document in that company's incorporation papers. He had been spending the money that should have kept that kitchen safe on gifts. I gave those records to Mercer in June. Mercer filed them where they needed to go. What happened after that was a consequence of what was already true, not something I manufactured, not something I exaggerated. The inspectors found what was there because it was there. I want to be clear about that. Pemberton told me about the rest of it, what happened in the office after the call ended. He had stayed in the room. Dorian had not asked him to leave, and he had not offered to go. And sometimes the most important things happen in spaces where no one has explicitly decided to stay. Dorian set the phone down on the desk. He did not throw it. He did not raise his voice. He stood very still for a moment, and then he walked to the window, the one with the view of the Chicago River that he had described once as the reason he had signed the lease. Pemberton said the silence lasted long enough that he felt the need to say something. Not to comfort him, he was past that, but because the silence had the specific quality of a situation that required someone to name what they were looking at. The flagship is the anchor of the whole brand, Pemberton said. The supplier contracts, the licensing agreements, the event bookings, they're all cross-referenced to that location. Without that operating license, Dorian raised one hand, not sharply, just enough to stop the sentence. Pemberton stopped. Outside the window, Michigan Avenue was moving the way it always moved cabs, pedestrians, the slow crawl of a delivery truck navigating the afternoon. The world had absolutely no idea what had happened in this room in the last 4 hours. That, Pemberton said, was the thing that seemed to strike Dorian most, not the facts themselves, but the indifference of everything outside the glass to the scale of what was collapsing inside it. He stood at that window for a long time, and then quietly, the way you say something you have been refusing to say for a while and have finally run out of reasons not to, he said a name. Not Tatum's, mine. Pemberton told me he didn't respond when Dorian said it. He said there was nothing to respond to, it wasn't a question, and it wasn't an accusation directed at him. It was the sound of a man finally understanding the shape of something that had been surrounding him for months without his knowledge. He said Dorian stood there for another moment and then turned from the window. "Get me everything we have on the suppliers," he said, "all of it." That was all. By the time Thornton walked through the front door of Dorian's building, I was somewhere above Ohio, 35,000 feet up above all of it. Stellan was asleep against the window. Wren had her head on my shoulder, her small hand wrapped around 2 of my fingers the way she had done since she was an infant, a habit she showed no interest in outgrowing, and one I had no interest in correcting. The flight attendant had come by twice. I had accepted a cup of tea and not touched it. I wasn't thinking about River North. I was watching the cloud cover below the wing and thinking about nothing in particular, which was the first time I had been able to think about nothing in particular in 8 months. I found out what happened that afternoon, the same way I had found out about most things by then, through Mercer, through Pemberton, through the slow accumulation of accounts from people who had been in the room and felt afterward that the record should exist somewhere outside of Dorian's version of events. Thornton had not come alone. He brought with him 2 men from the bank's commercial lending division field examiners, in the language of the institution, whose function was to conduct a physical inventory of the assets pledged as collateral against the outstanding loan, $4.5 million. A commercial credit facility that Dorian had first arranged 3 years earlier to fund the expansion of the River North location, secured against the restaurant equipment, the lease, the proprietary licensing agreements, and a tranche of the company's receivables. The TRO had frozen the accounts. The accounts being frozen meant the automatic payment scheduled for that morning, a monthly principal and interest installment of $62,000, had not cleared. Under the terms of the loan agreement, a missed payment triggered what the contract called an acceleration clause. The entire outstanding balance became due immediately, not on a revised schedule, not with a grace period, but now in full as of the moment the payment failed. Thornton had called that morning. Dorian had not answered. So Thornton had driven from Wacker Drive to River North because there are things you do not leave on voicemail. Pemberton met them in the lobby. He told me later that he had known they were coming before they arrived. Thornton had reached him by phone while Dorian was still on the line with his own attorney, and Pemberton had spent the intervening time doing what he did when situations exceeded his ability to manage them. He documented everything, moved nothing, and stayed in the building. He brought Thornton and the 2 examiners to the 3rd floor. He told the front desk not to announce them. Dorian was still at the window when they walked in. He turned when he heard the door. He looked at Thornton first, at the two men behind him, carrying clipboards and wearing the particular expression of people performing a function they have performed before and have learned to perform without effect, and something in his face went through a sequence of changes that Pemberton described as happening very quickly and very completely. "I need you to leave," Dorian said. Thornton's voice was even. "I'm sorry, Mr. Dorian, this isn't a request." He set a document on the desk, a single page, the bank's standard notice of default and collateral inspection authorization, signed by the lending division's compliance officer and referencing the loan agreement by date and number. Under the acceleration clause, the bank had the contractual right to conduct an immediate inventory of pledged assets upon payment default. It was not a search. It was not a seizure. It was an inspection they had already agreed to permit when Dorian had signed the loan documents 3 years ago on a Tuesday afternoon in a conference room on Wacker Drive, when the money had seemed like the beginning of something rather than the instrument of its end. The two examiners moved through the office with quiet efficiency. They were not there for the files. They were not there for the furniture. They were there for the specific items listed in the collateral schedule attached to the loan agreement. The commercial kitchen equipment at the River North location, which was, as of 2 hours ago, operating under a suspended license, the proprietary recipe and brand licensing portfolio, and the accounts receivable ledger that Pemberton had spent 6 years building into something that used to look like an asset. Pemberton watched the staff watch the examiners. He said the office had that quality again, the careful silence of people who understand that something is happening that they are not supposed to comment on, and who are trying very hard to appear focused on their screens. One of the junior account managers, a woman who had been with the company for 18 months, caught Pemberton's eye from across the room. He shook his head slightly. She looked back at her monitor. Dorian stood in the middle of the floor. Not at his desk, not at the window. In the middle of the open space, which Pemberton told me he had never seen him do before, Dorian was a man who positioned himself deliberately, who understood the geometry of rooms and always occupied the point of greatest authority within them. Standing in the middle of an open floor, equidistant from everything, was not something he did. It was something that happened to him. Pemberton set the paper in front of him. He had prepared it carefully, a single sheet organized in the way Dorian had always preferred his financial summaries. Clean columns, no color, no commentary. Just the numbers and what they represented. Contract terminations, $7.2 million in lost revenue. Early termination penalties, $1.8 million owed to departing partners. Operating license suspended. Pending compliance resolution, no revenue from flagship. Bank loan acceleration, $4.5 million due in full. Legal fees estimated ongoing. Projected cash shortfall against current operating capacity, $2.3 million minimum. Total exposure in a single business day, figures that had taken Dorian 11 years to build toward, and less than 7 hours to lose the ability to service. Dorian looked at the page. He didn't speak. He didn't move the paper. He stood very still, and Pemberton, who had worked beside this man through failed expansions, through a kitchen fire that had shut down the West Loop location for 3 months, through a vendor dispute that had gone to arbitration and cost them more than either side had expected, said he had never seen Dorian's hands look the way they looked in that moment. Not shaking, something quieter than that. A stillness that required effort. The kind that happens when the body understands something the mind is still refusing to say out loud. The field examiners finished their inventory at 4:47. Thornton collected his copy of the default notice, gave Dorian a card with a direct line for the bank's workout department, the division that handles loans in distress. A courtesy he extended because 6 years of relationship still counted for something even at the end of one and left without further comment. The door closed. The office was quiet. Pemberton was still there. He hadn't been asked to stay. He had simply stayed because someone needed to, and because he had spent 6 years in this building and did not think the record should consist only of Dorian's account of what happened next. And then the door opened again. Not Thornton, not the examiners, not the assistant from the front desk, Cordelia. She stepped inside, closed the door behind her, and turned the lock, a small, deliberate sound in a very quiet room. She looked at Dorian for a moment. Then she looked at Pemberton. "Give us the room," she said. It wasn't unkind. It was simply final. Pemberton left, and as the door closed behind him, he heard 4 words. Cordelia's voice low, and even carrying in the silence the way only certainty carries. "We need to talk." Stellan fell asleep somewhere above Indiana. Wren had her face pressed to the oval window, watching the clouds, the way she watched everything with a focused, unhurried attention that I had always found remarkable in a 6-year-old. The ability to be completely present inside a single thing. The clouds were thick and white below us, layered like something solid, and she had been narrating them quietly to herself for the past 20 minutes in a voice just barely above a whisper. I sat between my 2 children and thought about the word over. How many things were over? How many things had only just begun? Mom, Wren said without turning from the window, "What does Cambridge look like?" I had been asked this question in various forms for the past 3 weeks, since I had sat them both down at the kitchen table in Lincoln Park and told them that we were going somewhere new, that it would be good, that they would have a yard and a school and a room each, and that I would explain everything when they were older and ready, and that for now, the most important thing to know was that wherever we were going together. Stellan had asked 3 practical questions. How far was it? Did they have good pizza? Would he be able to keep his same library card? Wren had asked one, will there be a garden? I had promised her a garden. It looks like home, I told her now. It has old trees and brick houses and a yard with a wooden fence. And there's a school 2 blocks away that has a garden that the students take care of themselves. She turned from the window. Real vegetables. Real vegetables. She seemed to find this satisfactory. She turned back to the clouds. Stellan stirred beside me about 20 minutes later, that gradual resurfacing from sleep the children do, the slow blink, the small adjustment of the head. He looked out the window past Wren for a moment, orienting himself, and then he looked at me. Are we almost there? About an hour, I said. He nodded, processing. Then, is Aldous going to be at the house? Not today. He said he'd come by the weekend after we arrive. Give us time to settle. Stellan considered this. He was 9 and very serious about the things he chose to be serious about, which was most things, and which I had always privately believed was a quality he had inherited from my father rather than from anyone he had grown up watching. I like him, Stellan said. Not as a question, as a statement of fact that he wanted on the record. I know you do, and I said. He doesn't talk to me like I'm little. No, I said. He doesn't. I looked at the map on the small screen in the seat back in front of me, the thin animated line of our flight path arching across the country. The small plane icon suspended somewhere above the western edge of Ohio, the destination marker sitting on the eastern edge of Massachusetts. I thought about Aldous Whitmore, who had been my father's closest friend for 30 years, who had sat in a pew near the back at my father's funeral and had been, as far as I could tell, the only person in the building who had not shaken Dorian's hand at the reception afterward. I had noticed it at the time and said nothing. I had understood it fully only later. He's the kind of person, I said mostly to myself, though Stellan was listening, that your grandfather wanted you to have in your life when you were growing up. Stellan was quiet for a moment. Then he said, like he was looking out for us even after... I turned and looked at my son. Yes, I said, exactly like that. What was happening in River North while Wren watched clouds and Stellan thought about Aldous I didn't know in real time? I wouldn't piece it together until later, from what Pemberton told Cordelia and what Cordelia told me in layers across several weeks. What I knew was this: the office door had been closed. Cordelia had asked Pemberton to leave, and Pemberton, standing in the hallway outside, had heard the lock turn. He had waited. He told me later he wasn't sure why he had no reason to stay, no role left to perform in whatever was happening on the other side of that door. But he had stayed anyway, the way you stay when you've been present for too much of a thing to walk away from the ending. He heard voices low, not raised. He couldn't make out the words. He heard the quality of a conversation in which both people are being very careful, which is a different thing from a conversation in which both people are being calm. He heard Dorian say one sentence at a register clear enough to carry through the door. 3 words, not a question, a confirmation. Pemberton told me he didn't hear Cordelia's response if she gave one. He heard a silence that lasted long enough to mean something, and then nothing more. Until 20 minutes later, when the door opened and Cordelia walked out alone, her coat over her arm, and moved toward the elevator without looking back. She didn't stop when she passed Pemberton, but she said quietly without turning her head, "Make sure you eat something." Wren asked me about Boston 3 more times before we landed, not anxiously, but the way children ask things they have already half decided they will like, wanting the details filled in. I told her about the harbor. I told her about the swan boats and the public garden in spring. I told her about the way the leaves turned in October, which was different from Chicago's October, not better, just different, more red than gold. She listened with great seriousness and then announced that she wanted a red leaf when we got there. "I'll find you one," I said. "A big one." "A very big one." She smiled and put her face back against the window. The fasten seatbelt sign came on as we began our descent into Logan. The city appeared below us through the clouds, the harbor first, then the grid of streets, then the small illuminated lines of bridges and roads, and the quiet, ordinary geography of a place that didn't know we were arriving. Wren pressed her nose to the glass. Stellan put his hand on my arm, not asking for anything, just locating me the way he had done since he was small when he woke up in an unfamiliar place. I put my hand over his. What happened in that office, the full account of it. Everything Cordelia said and everything Dorian didn't say. The whole unedited version of the conversation behind the locked door I didn't get until weeks later. She came to Cambridge on a Saturday in October on a train from South Station. She knocked on the back door because the front gate latch was stiff, and I had warned her. I made tea. We sat in the yard, the 2 of us with the wooden fence and the late afternoon light coming through the oak tree and the tea going warm in our hands. And she told me everything. All of it. And now I'll tell you. Cambridge, 3 weeks after I arrived. The backyard had a smell that September afternoons in New England develop when the season has fully committed to turning dry leaves, cold earth, and something faint and sweet underneath it all that I later learned was the last of the cone flowers along the south fence doing what late-season flowers do, giving what remained of themselves to an audience of 2. Cordelia sat across from me, both hands around her mug. She had taken the early Amtrak from South Station and would take the 4 o'clock back. She had texted me that morning with the train number and a single line that said, "I think I owe you the rest of the story." I had put the phone face down on the counter and stood in the kitchen for a long moment before I replied. I had made tea. Real tea in a pot, the way my father had always made it, steeped long enough to be strong. Poured into the kind of plain ceramic mugs that don't require a decision about which one to use. Wren was at the back of the yard, moving slowly between the late-season flower beds with a small watering can she had found in the garden shed, giving water to things that probably didn't need it, but that she had decided were her responsibility. Cordelia watched her for a moment before she started. She told me what Dorian had said when she walked into the office that afternoon. 3 words. She said his voice had been very quiet when he said them, the kind of quiet that isn't the absence of feeling, but the decision to keep feeling somewhere out of reach, somewhere it can't be used against you. It was you. She hadn't answered immediately. She'd set her coat over the back of the chair nearest the door, sat down, and looked at him. Yes, she said. He looked at her the way she had described on the phone, the look reserved for people he was recalibrating. She said she had seen it before at negotiations and family arguments. In the half-second before he decided how to position himself, she had always, she told me, found it slightly sad that her brother's first instinct in every situation was to find his footing rather than to feel whatever the situation called for. What? He said, and she told him. She started at the beginning, not the beginning of that day, not the beginning of that year, but the beginning. She meant when she said beginning, 6 months after their father died, when the estate had been settled and the remaining assets distributed between the two of them. A joint fund held in trust, set aside from the sale of their father's home in Oak Park. The number had been $280,000 split equally, $140,000 for each of them. Dorian had managed the account she had agreed to that because he was the one with the financial infrastructure, the accountants, the systems. She had trusted him with her half because he was her brother, and because at 38 years old she had believed that whatever else he was capable of, he was not capable of that. She had been wrong. She found out 14 months later when she was reviewing the transfer records from a property deal Dorian had asked her to consult on. She was a real estate broker. He had asked her to review the comparable sales for a Streeterville building, a request so ordinary she hadn't questioned it, and she had seen the wire history attached to the purchase. $180,000 in 4 separate transfers drawn from the joint inheritance account, not from the marital account, not from company funds, from the account that still held alongside Dorian's contribution the money their father had left her. He had used her inheritance, not all of it, but enough of it, and without a word. That was his money, Dorian said, not asking, working it out. It was father's money, Cordelia said, which made it mine. Half of it was mine, Dorian. You used my half of father's money to buy a condominium for a woman who was lying to you. She told me she watched him absorb that, not the financial calculation he had processed that within seconds she said because numbers were always the thing he processed fastest. What took longer was the other part, the part that wasn't a number. He turned toward the window. He didn't speak. I didn't go to the partners out of spite, Cordelia said. I want you to know that. I went to the partners because you had already taken what didn't belong to you, and because the people those contracts employed deserved to know who they were in business with before that became their problem too. She paused. She told me the room was very quiet, and because, she said, if I'm being honest, I always knew you were with the wrong person in that marriage. I knew it before the affair. I knew it before any of this. And I spent 3 years telling myself it wasn't my business. She looked at him. It became my business when you used father's money. I hadn't spoken since she started. I was watching Wren at the back of the yard making her slow circuit between the flower beds, the small watering can tilting with a child's particular approximation of how much water is the right amount. The oak tree above the fence had started to turn at the edges, the slow red beginning that Wren had asked about on the plane that I had promised her in October. Why are you telling me all of this? I asked. Cordelia set her mug down. She looked at me for a moment in the way she had looked at Dorian in the office, the long, deliberate look of someone who has decided to say the true thing. Because you deserve to know that you weren't alone, she said. You were never alone in this. And I think I know it doesn't fix anything, but I think you should hear it from someone who was in that room. I looked at the yard. Wren had set down the watering can and was crouching beside a cluster of coneflowers near the fence, examining something small and specific the way she examined everything completely without hurry. I didn't say anything for a while. I didn't need to. She left on the 4:00 train. I walked her to the front gate. The latch was stiff, as I had warned her, and she worked it twice before it gave. She had her bag over one shoulder and the look of someone who has done a difficult thing and feels lighter for it. Not because the difficulty is gone, but because it has been set down somewhere visible. She stepped through onto the sidewalk and turned back once. Mercer has something else. She said, almost to herself, the way you say a thing you've been deciding whether to say and have finally decided. Something for Dorian. To do with Phoenix. I looked at her. She didn't explain. I didn't ask. Safe travels, I said. She nodded. The gate latched behind her. Mercer called that evening after Cordelia had gone. The house was quiet. Stellan and Wren were in bed, or close enough to it, the sounds of settling in drifting down from upstairs, the particular sequence of small movements that meant the day was ending. I was standing at the kitchen counter with a glass of water I hadn't touched, looking at the oak tree through the window. The yard was dark. The coneflowers were just a shape now. His voice when he came on had the quality it always had when he was about to say something that mattered level, unhurried the tone of a man who had learned over a long career. That information lands harder when you don't dress it up. There's something I need to tell you about Phoenix, he said. I moved to the table and sat down. He had assigned the background investigation 8 months earlier, shortly after our first meeting in January. When I had come to his office on a Wednesday morning with Briggs's name written on a notepad and a folder of transfer records I had printed at the library 3 days before anyone in the house had woken up. The investigator he used was a former Cook County court researcher named Delphine. He didn't give me her last name, and I didn't ask who had spent 20 years developing what Mercer described, without apparent irony as a talent for finding things that had been filed with the intention of being forgotten. She worked through public court indices, property records, and cross-referenced civil filings across multiple states. Phoenix had taken her 6 weeks. 4 years ago in Maricopa County, Arizona, a civil action had been filed by a man named Caldwell, a real estate developer, mid-40s married, moderately wealthy in the way that people who build strip malls in the outer suburbs of Sunbelt cities are moderately wealthy. The complaint alleged fraud, emotional distress, and financial misrepresentation in the context of a personal relationship. The relationship had involved a woman. The woman had claimed to be pregnant. The pregnancy, when medically verified at the insistence of Caldwell's attorney, had not been confirmed. The documentation Tatum had provided appointment records a positive result from a home test. A letter on what turned out to be a fraudulently reproduced clinic letterhead had not survived professional scrutiny. The civil case had been filed. A motion to seal had been granted within 30 days on the basis of a confidentiality agreement signed by both parties as part of a financial settlement. The case number still existed in the public index. The parties were listed. The filing date was there, and the motion to seal, and the case closure. The contents were protected. The fact of the thing was not. Delphine had found the case number first, then worked backward through property records and the Maricopa County Recorder's Office to establish the full picture. The settlement amount was not public. What was public, because Caldwell's divorce proceedings, which had followed shortly after, had referenced the matter in the initial petition, was the approximate range of the financial transfer involved, which had been characterized as significant by the filing attorney, and which Mercer estimated based on comparable settlements of that type in Arizona at that time, at somewhere in the range of $180,000, the same number as the inheritance account. I noticed that when Mercer said it, I didn't interrupt. He told me he had delivered the file to Dorian in person through a formal notice of disclosure as part of the ongoing dissolution proceedings. He had done it himself, not through a courier, not through the assistant. He said he had wanted to be there. Dorian had read the summary page first. Then he had turned to the photograph standard practice in civil investigation files, a headshot pulled from the Phoenix case documentation, a clear image taken at the time of the original proceedings. Mercer said Dorian had not spoken for a long time. He was looking at the photograph. Mercer told me he understood what Dorian was seeing, the same face, the same posture, the same particular quality of attention in the eyes that Mercer himself had noticed when he had first reviewed the file and thought she has done this before, and she was not nervous doing it. He looked at it. Mercer said, "The way you look at something when the facts are clear and you are working very hard to find a different explanation and you cannot find one." Then Dorian had set the photograph face down on the desk. He asked, "Does Verity know about this?" Mercer said, "She's known for 6 months." Dorian didn't respond. He looked at the window. He looked at the desk. He looked at nothing in particular for a long time, which Mercer said was the most honest thing he had seen Dorian do in the entirety of their interaction. I want to be honest with you about what I felt when Mercer told me that. I had expected to feel something clean, the satisfaction of a thing completed, the particular relief of evidence finally being where it needed to be. I had carried those 8 months carefully, had made the decisions I made with as much precision as I was capable of, and I had told myself that when it was over, I would feel the weight lift. What I actually felt was quieter than that, harder to name. It wasn't satisfaction. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't even relief exactly, or not only relief, it was something that sat underneath all of those things, something that didn't have a clean word but that I can only describe as grief. Not grief for Dorian, not grief for what he had done or for what the marriage had been. Grief for the version of things that hadn't happened, for the years that went one way instead of another, for a man I had once believed I was building a life with, who had made a series of decisions over a very long time that I had not been consulted about and could not change, and who was now sitting in an office somewhere in Chicago looking at a photograph that proved he had never been who I thought he was. I didn't say any of this to Mercer. He was my attorney. It wasn't his job, but I sat in that kitchen for a long time after the call ended with the oak tree dark beyond the window and the house quiet above me, and I let the grief be what it was. There was one more thing Mercer said before he hung up. He had said it briefly at the end, the way he said things he considered important but didn't want to editorialize clearly once, and then left it for me to sit with. "There's something you should know," he said, "about the money, where it came from. The account that funded your legal preparation, the inheritance account, the one Aldous managed." He paused. "It's yours," he said. "It was always yours. But there's something about your father and Aldous that I think you should hear. I'll send you a letter this week. Read it before we talk." He said goodnight. I sat at the table for a long time after. I made a second cup of tea after I got off the phone with Mercer. Stellan was already asleep. Wren had left a drawing on the kitchen table, a house with a garden, 2 stick figures standing in front of it, one taller and one shorter, both with curly hair rendered in brown crayon in wide, confident loops. There was a tree in the corner with red leaves. She had drawn it without telling me. She had left it there the way children leave things they make for you without ceremony, as if the making of it is the whole point, and the finding of it is yours to do. I sat down beside it and called Aldous. He answered on the second ring. It was late, nearly 10, and he had an early seminar the following morning, he told me, which was the first thing he said after hello. He said it the way he said most things, plainly, without preamble, as if the fact of the seminar was simply part of the context and not a complaint. "I read the letter," I said. "I know," he said. "I was expecting you to call." There was a pause, not uncomfortable. The kind of pause that exists between people who have known each other long enough to not fill silence for its own sake. "Tell me from the beginning," I said. He told me. Your father, he said, had been worried about Dorian from the start. Not in a way he had ever made explicit. Not to Dorian, not to me, not even fully to Aldous, who had been his closest friend for nearly 3 decades. He had liked Dorian. He had found him capable and charming and genuinely attentive in those early years to the things that mattered. But he had also, Aldous said this carefully, the way he said things that were observations rather than judgments, noticed in him a particular quality of wanting, a hunger for the version of life that came with a certain kind of success, not the work of it, the arrival. When Dorian's first restaurant had been in its early stages before the investors, before the Tribune Review, when it was a 40-seat room in River North that existed more as ambition than as anything else, he had come to my father. He had asked for a loan, not from a bank, not from a business contact, from my father, his father-in-law, the man whose daughter he had married 2 years earlier. The man who had shaken his hand at the wedding with the particular warmth of someone who had decided to believe in a person and meant it. $85,000. No promissory note. No repayment schedule. No formal agreement of any kind. Just a conversation in my parents' kitchen in Oak Park and a handshake. And my father writing a check because he believed in his son-in-law's vision and because he loved his daughter and because Aldous said, he had always been a man who led with trust and hoped the world would meet him there. Dorian had deposited the check the following week. He had never repaid $1 of it. Did my father ever ask for it back? I said. Once, Aldous said, indirectly. About 3 years later, when the restaurant was doing well. He mentioned it in conversation, not as a demand, more as a testing of the water. Dorian changed the subject. Your father let it go. Why? Aldous was quiet for a moment. Because he didn't want to make it a problem between you, he said. He didn't want you to know that your marriage had started with a debt your husband owed your father and had never bothered to repay. He thought it would color the way you saw things. He was trying to protect the version of your life he wanted you to have. I looked at Wren's drawing, the 2 stick figures standing in front of the house, the tree with the red leaves in the corner. He never told me, I said. No, Aldous said. He made me promise not to. He said it was his to carry, not yours. I asked Aldous when he had decided to tell me. He said the decision had been made for him in a sense when I called him in January, when I had described in careful and controlled language what I had found on Stellan's tablet and what I intended to do about it. He had listened to the whole thing without interrupting, and when I finished, he had asked me one question, whether I was certain. I had told him yes. He had said, then I think it's time. What Aldous managed, what he had managed since my father's death 3 years earlier as the executor of his estate and the trustee of the remaining assets held in trust, included, among other things, a reserve account set aside specifically for my benefit. Not split with Dorian, not part of the marital estate. My father had been careful about that in the end. Aldous told me he had updated the trust documents 6 months before he died quietly, without explaining why to anyone, to ensure that the reserve was mine alone. The money that had funded 8 months of legal preparation, the money that had paid Mercer's retainer the investigator's fees, the filing costs, and the documentation services. It had come from that account. It was always yours, Verity, Aldous said. I was only keeping it until you needed it. I was quiet for a long time. Outside the kitchen window, the yard was dark, the oak tree a silhouette, the garden beds just shapes in the moonlight, the wooden fence at the back edge of the property barely visible. The cone flowers Wren had been watering all week had finally quietly finished for the season. Did Dorian ever ask about it? I said. The loan. After my father died. Once, Aldous said. About 2 years after you were married. He called me. I think he had found a reference to it somewhere, possibly in your father's papers. He asked me about an outstanding personal transfer. He paused. I told him I didn't know what he was referring to. He said. He didn't ask again. There was something in the way Aldous said this, very deliberate, that contained, without stating, exactly how much he had understood about Dorian from that single phone call and exactly how long he had been waiting in his particular patient way for the situation to resolve itself into something that could be addressed. "Thank you," I said, "for keeping it, for waiting." "Your father asked me to look after you," Aldous said. In his way, this was his way. Before we said goodnight, he told me one more thing. He said it without introduction, the way you say something that has been waiting to be said and has finally found its moment. "Your father used to tell me you were the strongest person he had ever known," he said. He said it long before any of this happened. Long before you knew it would ever need to be true. He simply knew it. The way fathers know things about their children that the children haven't discovered yet. I didn't say anything. He would have been very proud, Aldous said. He is, in whatever way that's still possible. I looked out at the dark garden. Tomorrow, Stellan would walk into a new school in a new city and sit down at a desk among children he had never met. And he would do it with the same serious, deliberate attention he brought to everything, and he would be fine. I knew he would be fine. I had known it since the plane, since he had put his hand on my arm over the darkened fields of Indiana without asking for anything, just locating me. "Good night, Aldous," I said. "Good night, Verity. The last things I know about Dorian, I know them, because Pemberton told Cordelia, and Cordelia told me. I won't pretend I witnessed any of it, but I think it matters that you hear it, because a story isn't only what happens to the person telling it, it's also what happens to the people they left behind." Pemberton submitted his resignation on a Tuesday morning in early October. He brought it in person, a single printed page set on the desk without ceremony. He told Cordelia later that he had written it 4 times before he found the version that said what he meant without saying more than he needed to. What he said standing in the office one last time was this: "I watched you throw away everything you built, Dorian. I stayed quiet for too long, that's on me, but I can't stay." Dorian didn't respond. He was looking at the desk. Pemberton was nearly at the door when he stopped. "There's something you should know," he said. "About the first restaurant," he told him. The menu, Verity had built it from scratch, sourcing every supplier herself, testing every dish at the kitchen table on Maple Street before a single investor had been approached. The layout of the dining room, the name above the door, the particular warmth the space had that reviewers kept describing and never quite explained, that had been her vision, entirely. "You hired the chef," Pemberton said. "You signed the lease, but the idea, all of it, was hers." Dorian said nothing. Pemberton pulled open the top drawer of the filing cabinet by the window, the one that had belonged to the office before Dorian had moved in, the one that still held things from the early years that no one had gotten around to sorting. He found what he was looking for almost immediately, as if he had known it was there. A small card, cream-colored, handwritten. He set it on the desk. Then he left. The card read, "I am so proud of you. We did this," signed with Verity's name, the ink slightly faded. The handwriting from years ago when she'd still written, like someone who believed in the permanence of things. "We, not you." Dorian sat with it for a long time. Rosalind called Mercer's office on a Wednesday. She asked to speak with Verity. Mercer's assistant took the message and sent it through to me as a transcript Mrs. Rosalind called. She said, quote, "Tell her my card was declined this morning. Tell her I need to talk to her." I read it at the kitchen table in Cambridge with the yard visible through the window and Wren somewhere in the garden with her watering can. I sat with it for a moment. The card had been declined because the TRO, which had frozen Dorian's accounts, had also suspended a secondary account from which Rosalind had apparently been receiving a monthly transfer, an arrangement that had existed, Mercer told me later, for at least 3 years, and that had never been disclosed during the financial review in the mediation paperwork. She was not calling because she was sorry. She was calling because the money had stopped. I folded the transcript once and put it in the kitchen drawer. I looked out at Wren, who was crouching near the fence, examining something in the soil with the complete attention she brought to small things. I didn't feel what I thought I would feel. I didn't feel anything in particular, which was, I realized sitting there, its own kind of answer. Dorian was alone in the office that evening. The staff had gone. Pemberton had gone. The field examiners had completed their work. The phones had stopped ringing or he had stopped answering them, which, by that point, amounted to the same thing. He opened his laptop. The screensaver had timed out, and the desktop was visible a photograph still set as the background from months ago, from a summer afternoon 3 years earlier at the lake house on Lake Michigan. Verity was sitting on the dock with Stellan beside her, both of them looking at the water. Wren was standing at the edge of the frame with her arms out about to run somewhere. He had taken the photo. He remembered that much. He did not remember whose idea the trip had been. He did not remember who had packed the car or made the reservation or remembered to bring the children's swim shoes. He did not remember anything except that he had been thinking that afternoon about a supplier contract that needed to be renegotiated before the end of the quarter. He looked at the photograph for a long time, then he closed the laptop. I don't know what he did after that. I stopped asking. There are stories you have to let end on their own, not because you don't care, but because you no longer need to know. That is a different thing from indifference. It took me a long time to understand the difference. But sitting in that Cambridge kitchen with the yard going quiet in the October light, I understood it finally. I let it go. October in Cambridge is nothing like October in Chicago. In Chicago, October means wind off the lake, honest and relentless, the kind that reminds you the city was built on the edge of something much larger than itself. In Cambridge, it means wood smoke and the particular quiet of a university town settling into a new academic year. The streets full of people carrying purpose. The trees turning at a pace that seems almost deliberate, as if the season is taking its time because it knows what it looks like. I had been here 3 weeks when I finally stopped waking up afraid. Stellan came home from school one afternoon in the middle of the month with a look I recognized, the slightly windswept, quietly lit expression he got when something had interested him beyond his usual capacity to contain it. He dropped his backpack at the door, came into the kitchen, and said without preamble, "Mom, we looked at actual cells today, under a real microscope, like actual living cells." "Tell me," I said. He did. For 20 minutes, standing at the counter while I made dinner, he described the structure of the cells with the focused specificity of someone who had found, in a science classroom 2 blocks from our new house, a small and precise miracle. He used his hands. He drew a diagram on the back of a permission slip I hadn't read yet. When he finished, he picked up his backpack and went upstairs to do his homework. I stood at the stove and thought he is going to be fine, not as a hope, as a fact. Wren had claimed the garden. By the 3rd week of October, she had named most of the plants along the south fence, not their botanical names, which she asked me to look up on my phone and then mostly set aside, but her own names, which were more reliable guides to her inner taxonomy. The tall purple asters near the gate were the professors. The low ground cover along the fence line she called the carpet family, a single late-blooming coneflower she had been watering since the day we arrived. Still holding 2 small orange petals against all seasonal logic, she called the holdout. "Why the holdout?" I asked her. She thought about it seriously. "Because it's still here," she said, "even though it's not supposed to be." I wrote that down later in the notebook I had started keeping on the kitchen windowsill. I wasn't sure why it mattered. It did. Aldous came for dinner on a Wednesday evening. He brought bread from a bakery near his office and a bottle of cider he said was from an orchard in Vermont that his students had taken him to the previous fall. And he sat at the kitchen table while I cooked and talked to Stellan and Wren with the unhurried ease of a man who had spent 40 years in classrooms and understood that the best conversations with children happen sideways, without agenda. At some point, Stellan asked, "Was Grandpa funny?" Aldous set down his glass. He thought about it with genuine attention, the way he considered everything. "He was the funniest person I ever knew," he said. But he was sneaky about it. He'd say something completely straight-faced, and you'd be 3 sentences later before you realized you were laughing. Stellan nodded, filing this away. Wren said, "I think I have that." Aldous looked at her. "I think you might," he said. After dinner, while the children were clearing plates with the negotiated efficiency of a system they had apparently developed on their own, Aldous stood beside me at the counter. He didn't say anything. He put his hand briefly on my shoulder once the way my father used to, and then moved to help Wren, who had decided the glasses needed to be re-washed. He didn't need to say anything. I already knew. After Aldous left and the children were in bed, I went looking for a box I had packed in August and not opened since the one labeled in my own handwriting studio /MISC, which was the category I had given to the things I hadn't known how to sort. I found it at the back of the hall closet. I carried it to the kitchen table and opened it. On top, a rolled portfolio sleeve, the kind used for large format drawings, the fabric faded at the edges. I unrolled it carefully. Inside were sketches from my final year of design school spatial studies, elevation drawings, a site plan for a project I had loved and presented and largely forgotten in the years that followed. The lines were confident in the way that early work sometimes is, before experience teaches you to be cautious. I spread them on the table. I ran my hand across one of the drawings, the long diagonal of a roof line, the crosshatch of a textured wall, and felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not nostalgia, something more present than that, a recognition. This was mine. I sat with that for a while. That night, after the house was quiet, I found my old technical pencil at the bottom of the box and set a blank sheet of paper on the table. I sat there for a moment. Then I drew something. Just for me. Nothing planned, nothing required. A line, then another, then the beginning of something I couldn't yet name, but recognized as a start. It was the first thing I had made in 7 years that belonged entirely to myself. The email had arrived the night before, 3 weeks and 2 days after I left Chicago. I was in the kitchen packing the children's lunchboxes when my phone lit up on the counter. I had been moving through the morning the way I had learned to move through mornings here, without urgency, without the low-grade vigilance that had become so habitual in my last year in that house on Maple Street that I had stopped noticing it until it was gone. Stellan's lunch was turkey and cheddar on whole wheat, the crusts cut off, which he had recently decided was a preference rather than a requirement, but which I continued to honor because some things are worth the extra 30 seconds. Wren wanted her apple slices in a separate container so they didn't touch the crackers. I picked up the phone. The email was from Harlow Studio, South End, Boston, a small firm. Their website said 8 designers, 2 principals, a project list that ran toward adaptive reuse and residential renovation, the kind of work that begins with what already exists and asks what it could become. They had found my portfolio, not a recent one, the online archive I had kept from my years before the children, before the marriage had consumed the hours that used to belong to my work. I hadn't updated it in years. I hadn't taken it down either for no particular reason, the way you keep things you aren't ready to let go of even when you've stopped tending to them. The email was 3 short paragraphs. They had a project beginning in the spring. They thought my background might be relevant. They weren't looking to fill a position. They said just to have a conversation, not an interview, just a conversation. I stood at the counter and read it twice. Stellan came into the kitchen at full speed, stopped, and said, "Mom, where's my lunchbox?" "Right here." I handed it to him without looking up. "The blue one." "That is the blue one." He took it, examined it with the scrutiny of someone checking cargo before a long voyage, and appeared satisfied. He disappeared back down the hallway. Ren came in a minute later, one shoe on and one in her hand, trailing the lace like a surrender flag. "I can't," she announced. I put the phone down and crouched in front of her. I tied the lace double knotted the way she preferred, the way I had tied it approximately 400 times in the past 2 years, and looked up at her face while I did it, the serious concentration she brought to being helped, as if watching carefully was a form of participation. "There," I said. She looked at the shoe. "The other one I can do myself," she said. "I just didn't want to." "That's valid," I said. She grinned. I walked them to the front door, checked backpacks, verified that Stellan had his library book, and that Ren had her permission slip for the school garden visit later that week. Stellan stepped onto the front path, then stopped. He turned back and looked at me the way he sometimes looked at things he had been thinking about and had decided to say out loud. "Mom," he said, "are we going to be okay?" I knew the question. I had heard it before in a car on Lakeshore Drive 8 months earlier, with the Chicago skyline going past the window and everything we were leaving still visible in the rearview mirror. That morning, I hadn't answered. I hadn't known how. I looked at my son standing on the front path of a house in Cambridge, with his library book under his arm and the October light coming through the oak tree above the fence, turning everything gold. "Yes," I said, "we are." He held my gaze for a moment, the particular steadiness of a 9-year-old who has learned to read the difference between reassurance and truth, and who has just confirmed they are the same thing. He nodded once. Then he turned and walked toward the school bus, unhurried the way he walked into every room he had decided to enter. Ren waved from the end of the path, both arms, the full wingspan. "Bye, Mom. I love you so much." "I love you so much," I called back. I stood in the doorway until the bus came. Back in the kitchen, I read the email one more time. Then I typed a reply. Short the way I had learned to say important things since that September morning in the mediation office, without excess, without performance. "Thank you for reaching out. I would be glad to talk. I'm available this week." I pressed send. I poured a cup of coffee. I sat down at the kitchen table, the one where Ren's drawings accumulated at the end of each day, where Stellan did his homework with focused, unhurried concentration, where I had read Mercer's messages and Aldis's letter and learned piece by piece what had been true all along. I sat there and felt the morning settle around me. No dread, no vigilance, no waiting for the next thing to go wrong. Just the kitchen and the oak tree going gold outside the window and the quiet that belongs to a house where children have recently left for school and will be home again by 3. Some things in this life end so quietly that you don't know they're gone until you're somewhere else entirely, standing in a different kitchen, watching different leaves fall past a different window, and realizing that the weight you carried for so long has simply ceased to be there. Not because someone took it from you, because you finally set it down yourself. This is a story about family betrayal, and I say that as the person who lived it, not the person who observed it from a safe distance. Family betrayal does not always arrive loudly. It arrives in small silences, in signatures you didn't read, in accounts you were never shown, in a name on a clinic document that didn't match the one you were told. I stayed too long. I told myself things I knew were not true. I made myself smaller in a space that was already shrinking around me. If you take nothing else from what I've shared, take this. Do not wait until the silence becomes a room you cannot leave. That is the one thing I wish I had done differently. Don't be the version of me who waits. What I chose was not easy. Family revenge, the legal kind. The patient kind, the kind built on 8 months of documentation and very early mornings, is not a path I recommend without cost. Family revenge takes something from you even when it is justified, and family revenge that comes from pain, alone without truth, behind it will hollow you out. Know the difference before you begin. I believe, and I say this once, and I mean it, that God sees what is carried in private, that nothing done in darkness stays there forever. The truth arrived. It always does. This story is mine, but if any part of it felt like yours, leave a comment below. Share it with someone who needs to hear it tonight. And if you want to stay for what comes next, you already know what to do. Thank you for staying until the very end. That means everything. Before the next story begins, the narratives on this channel include fictional elements constructed with care for educational and reflective purposes. If this type of content is not what you are looking for, please feel free to choose something that serves you better. No judgment, only respect for your time.
I appreciate you watching this with me. I'll see you in the next story.